At the dawn of the 21st century, Russia stood at the edge of a promise few thought possible. After decades of isolation and economic collapse, global investors began to whisper a word once unthinkable alongside its name: opportunity. Skyscrapers rose over Moscow's frozen skyline. Oil money flowed like a revival hymn. Western banks opened doors that had been sealed shut for generations. For a moment, it seemed history had softened its grip. But beneath the polished boardrooms and booming exports, something quieter was taking shape. A fragile financial architecture built on assumptions no one wanted to test. Power concentrated, markets bent, and decisions made far from public view began to ripple outward, crossing borders, currencies, and continents. Then, almost without warning, confidence cracked. Investors across Europe watched in disbelief as risk calculations collapsed overnight. Emerging markets flinched. Energy-dependent nations recalculated their futures. And inside Russia itself, ordinary citizens felt a familiar chill, the sense that global forces had once again slipped beyond their control. How did a nation once celebrated as a financial comeback story become a destabilizing force in the global economy? And more importantly, could the same invisible pressures be forming elsewhere, right now? If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover hidden global truths shaping the world we live in. And tell us, where are you watching from? This is not just the story of Russia. It's a story about modern finance, power, and the quiet moments when the world fails to notice a turning point, until it's too late. In the early 2000s, Russia appeared to be rewriting its own fate. The chaos of the post-Soviet collapse was still visible in shuttered factories and fading apartment blocks, but something new was rising above them. Global commodity prices surged, and Russia's vast reserves of oil, gas, and metal suddenly felt like a winning hand in a reshuffled global economy. For international financiers, this was a country no longer defined by shortages, but by scale. From London to Frankfurt, analysts adjusted their models. Russia's debt levels were falling. Foreign reserves were climbing at a pace that startled even seasoned economists. The state paid off loans ahead of schedule, sending a powerful message: this was a nation reclaiming control. Headlines spoke of stabilization, of discipline, of a government that had learned from the humiliations of the 1990s. Inside Moscow, the transformation felt tangible. Luxury cars slid past Soviet-era monuments. New banks offered mortgages in glossy offices lined with marble and glass. For young professionals, the future seemed suddenly open. Many believed Russia was finally becoming what policymakers had long promised: a normal country in a global system. Yet this rebirth rested on an unspoken bargain. Political power was becoming more centralized, even as markets were liberalized just enough to attract foreign capital. The state allowed wealth to accumulate rapidly, but only within carefully drawn boundaries. Oligarchs who aligned with the Kremlin flourished, those who didn't vanished from headlines, and sometimes from public life altogether. Foreign investors noticed the pattern, but few challenged it. The returns were too attractive. Energy contracts were long-term. Risk premiums looked manageable. After all, global markets had learned to live with imperfect systems before. And for a while, the numbers kept confirming the optimism. But beneath the confidence, Russia's financial revival had a narrow foundation. Its prosperity leaned heavily on commodity exports, priced in foreign currencies, vulnerable to shifts far beyond its borders. The system worked beautifully, as long as the world remained predictable. That assumption would soon be tested. As Russia's coffers filled, so did its ambitions. The government began to see economic strength not just as prosperity, but as leverage. Energy exports became instruments of influence. Pipelines were no longer just infrastructure, they were geopolitical arteries, tying neighboring nations to Moscow's decisions. In Eastern Europe, policymakers quietly debated their dependence. In Western capitals, energy firms reassured shareholders that commercial logic would always outweigh politics. After all, Russia needed customers as much as customers needed Russia. Mutual reliance, the thinking went, was a stabilizing force. Domestically, the financial system grew more sophisticated, but also more fragile. State-controlled banks expanded rapidly, funneling cheap credit into favored sectors. Corporate debt climbed, often denominated in dollars or euros, a silent gamble that exchange rates would remain stable. It looked efficient on paper. It looked modern. And it masked a growing vulnerability. Ordinary Russians felt the shift in subtle ways. Salaries rose, but so did household debt. Imported goods filled store shelves, tying daily life to global supply chains few understood. The economy felt integrated, even cosmopolitan. Yet beneath that surface, decision-making was becoming increasingly opaque. Outside observers sensed contradictions. Transparency rankings slipped. Capital flight quietly increased even during boom years. Some insiders hedged their fortunes abroad, purchasing property in London or Cyprus, a signal few wanted to interpret too closely. The illusion of rebirth depended on faith in stable energy prices, faith in political continuity, faith that global finance would remain accommodating. It also depended on something more fragile: trust. When trust erodes, markets don't protest. They retreat. And somewhere deep within the system, the first cracks were already spreading. The first shock did not arrive as a collapse, but as a question. In trading rooms from New York to Tokyo, analysts began to ask whether Russia's economic strength was as solid as it appeared. The global financial crisis of 2008 had exposed how quickly confidence could evaporate, and Russia, despite its reserves, was not immune. When oil prices plunged, the effects rippled instantly through Moscow's balance sheets. Revenue projections unraveled. The ruble wavered. Corporations that had borrowed heavily in foreign currencies suddenly found their obligations swelling overnight. What once looked like smart financial engineering began to resemble a trap. International investors reacted cautiously at first. Many assumed this was a temporary shock, a downturn to be weathered. But then came the political signals. As global tensions rose, Russia's leadership leaned into sovereignty, into self-reliance, into a worldview that placed strategic control above market reassurance. Capital markets are sensitive to tone. A single speech can move billions. Subtle changes in language about foreign influence, national champions, and economic independence began to alter risk calculations. In Europe, banks quietly reduced exposure. In Asia, energy traders revised long-term assumptions. Inside Russia, the response was swift but revealing. The state intervened to stabilize key institutions, reinforcing the idea that survival depended on proximity to power. Smaller firms struggled. Innovation slowed. And beneath official statements of resilience, anxiety crept in. For ordinary citizens, the shift felt familiar. Savings lost value. Prices rose unevenly. The sense of upward momentum stalled, replaced by cautious pragmatism. The promise of integration with the global economy began to feel conditional, granted, but easily withdrawn. Then came the moment when markets stopped giving Russia the benefit of the doubt. That moment arrived not with numbers, but with borders. Political decisions triggered economic consequences at a scale few had predicted. Sanctions, once a theoretical risk, became a concrete reality. Access to global capital narrowed. Technology transfers slowed. Partnerships that had taken decades to build unraveled in months. Across Europe, policymakers faced their own reckoning. Dependence on Russian energy was no longer an abstract concern. It was a vulnerability, exposed under the harsh light of geopolitical conflict. Governments scrambled to diversify supply, even as costs rose and public patience wore thin. Financial markets responded with brutal efficiency. Russian assets were repriced almost overnight. Credit ratings fell. Payment systems fractured. What had once been a promising emerging market was now labeled a systemic risk, not just to itself, but to the global order. In Asia, reactions were cautious, measured. Some saw opportunity in discounted resources. Others worried about secondary consequences, about being drawn into a widening economic divide. Global trade routes adjusted, quietly, methodically. Inside Russia, adaptation became the official narrative. New partnerships were announced. Alternative financial systems were promoted. But adaptation came at a price. Isolation reduced competition. Innovation slowed further. And the cost of capital remained stubbornly high. Perhaps the most striking change was psychological. The idea of Russia as a bridge between East and West faded. In its place emerged a posture of endurance, of standing apart rather than integrating. Markets had made their decision. Risk was no longer theoretical. And the world would spend years adjusting to that realization. As the headlines faded and markets adjusted, the deeper consequences of Russia's transformation became less visible, but more enduring. Global systems, once designed around efficiency and interdependence, began to fracture into cautious blocks. Supply chains shortened. Financial relationships hardened along political lines. What had happened with Russia no longer felt like an exception, but a warning. In boardrooms across Europe, executives spoke in lower tones about resilience rather than growth. In emerging economies, leaders watched closely, aware that prosperity built on narrow foundations could vanish with a single shock. The Russian case had revealed how quickly trust, once lost, could not be engineered back through policy alone. Inside Russia, daily life settled into a new rhythm. The economy did not collapse in dramatic fashion. Instead, it adapted, unevenly, imperfectly. Consumers adjusted expectations. Businesses learned to operate with fewer options. A generation that had grown up believing in global integration now navigated a more closed horizon. Culturally, something shifted. Self-reliance became not just a policy goal, but a social narrative. Endurance was celebrated. Adaptation was praised. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the cost of isolation lingered in missed opportunities and quiet compromises. International observers took note of a paradox. Russia had insulated itself from certain global shocks, but at the expense of influence within the very systems it once sought to shape. Financial autonomy brought control and constraint. The lesson was not about morality, but mechanics. Global finance rewards openness, but only when trust flows freely. Once that trust is questioned, even the strongest reserves offer limited protection. For the rest of the world, the story carried implications far beyond Russia. Economies built on concentration, of power, of resources, of decision-making, began to look more fragile than they appeared. The illusion of stability, sustained by favorable conditions, could mask risks accumulating just beneath the surface. In Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and beyond, policymakers quietly reassessed assumptions long taken for granted. Could economic integration truly neutralize political conflict? Or had the world mistaken efficiency for resilience? The Russian experience suggested an uncomfortable truth: markets do not enforce values. They enforce incentives. When incentives change, loyalty dissolves without sentiment. Global capital moves not with anger, but with silence. And perhaps the most human lesson lay in the spaces between charts and policies. Ordinary lives are shaped by decisions made far away, often without consent or warning. The distance between a geopolitical choice and a grocery store price is shorter than it appears. In the end, Russia's journey from financial hope to global risk was not a sudden fall, but a gradual narrowing of possibilities. A story of choices layered upon choices, until alternatives quietly disappeared. The world watched, adjusted, and moved on. But the systems that allowed this transformation remain very much in place. In the end, stories like this remind us that the global economy is not an abstract machine, but a living system shaped by trust, memory, and human choice. Borders may divide nations, but financial currents ignore them, carrying consequences far beyond their point of origin. Russia's transformation was not inevitable. It was the result of moments when opportunity met fear, when control was chosen over openness, when short-term stability eclipsed long-term connection. These are decisions every nation faces, in different forms, at different times. And as the world grows more fragmented, the quiet question lingers, not just about Russia, but about us all. What happens when confidence disappears, before we even notice it fading? If you'd like more stories that explore the hidden forces shaping our shared future, stay with us. Because in a connected world, no economic story ever truly ends.